Okay, I just wanted to kind of start with a positive, if you like. Yesterday's news that Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, is going to give us £100 off our average driving bills next year. How that plays out in the petrol pump prices, we are yet to find out, but £100 in the pocket is nothing to be sniffed at. But if you live in London, that £100 will be spent in 2 weeks driving into the ULEZ zone. It's 3 weeks in Birmingham, so it'll disappear fairly quickly. Over the course of 1 year in London, you'll spend £3,250 in fines or whatever you want to call it, charges going into the London area. So from the budget yesterday, we saw that kind of theatricality, that performance, that pretense of what's available, and then there's the detail, which we're working out now. Basically what we're paying for, and then who's going to pay for it. So there's a couple of things I just wanted to do today, especially in the light of this conversation about LTNs and ULEZ and what have you, which is the real conversation piece around urban development today, is to provide some ammunition for those people who are involved in these conversations, some arguments about this stuff, because very often we're on the back foot in some of these conversations, but actually I think we've got some stronger arguments than maybe even we give ourselves credit for. So I want to look at some of the realities rather than the pretense. And I'll take two topics. First one is pollution, which is a big concern. If anybody hasn't done their Christmas shopping yet, Mayor Sadiq Khan in London has got a book coming out in May. It's called Breathe, about pollution. On the back, it's not out yet, so on the back cover it says, for many years, Sadiq wasn't fully aware of the dangers posed by air pollution. Then at the age of 43, he was unexpectedly diagnosed with adult-onset asthma brought on by the polluted London air he'd been breathing for decades. And that kind of story, that general tone of the discussion that, we've all been stupidly walking around absorbing all this toxic pollution until the savior comes along and makes us kind of realize the error of our ways, is a load of nonsense. London's air has never been cleaner. Birmingham's air has never really been cleaner. And I think that's something we have to recognize, because if you just listen to the way it's been promoted, you'd never imagine that that was the case. So I just got a couple of facts for you from 1990 to 2008, the stats. I've got later stats, but this is the jump in quality. PM10s, those kind of particulate matters, declined by 53% in those 20 years. Black smoke emissions declined by 85%. Carbon monoxide declined by 70%. Sulfur dioxide down 86%. Nitrous oxide, the big one that we'd all talk about today, 50% reduction. And lead, I don't know if you remember lead, used to be a very big problem 30 years ago, down 98%. To all intents and purposes, lead in the atmosphere just doesn't exist. There's plenty of researchers that will find it for you if you pay them enough, but generally, the air has never been cleaner. And if you saw a program on, I think, Channel 4 a couple of weeks ago, which was about the London smog of 1952, that was a time when 12,000 people in London died in 2 weeks in London. Yes, I mean, we do not have smogs in this country, yes, much as people like to imagine that maybe we do. And if you look at, well, it depends on whose statistics we use. I don't mean who as in the World Health Organization. I mean, look at most health professional statistics, and they say about 9,000 people die of air pollution in London every year, which is 350 people every fortnight. So however you look at it, every death is a tragedy and all that, but 12,000 in 1952 down to 350 today, I think that's an improvement, okay? And we have to kind of put credit where it's due. Public Health England, that wonderful organization, if you remember them, estimates that annually in Britain, across Britain, 28,000 or 36,000, depending on the stats, die every year from pollution, attributable to PM 2.5s, smaller particulates. And we all know about, died of, died from, died with, and all that, but, attributable to PM 2.5s. David Spiegelhalter, who's been around since COVID looking at stats, shows that actually those deaths, that kind of 36,000 people, is a statistical projection. So, your allotted time, if it's reduced by anything like as much as 3 days from when you're meant to die in the statistical computer analysis, that is classified then as a premature death for the stats, 3 days. That's stupid enough. But if you think that in the last 50 years, since 1970, the average lifespan of a person living in this country has gone up by 10 years. So in 1970, you may have died at 75. Today, you died at 85. Anybody that complains that their death has been reduced by 3 days deserves a slap, as far as I'm concerned, okay? Don't look a gift horse in the mouth, I would say. And those people who are dying of severe respiratory diseases, which again, is on the increase. But also, I think that we just have to be careful that we're not, well, I'm not trying to tell you to be suspicious or not believe the science, but I think we need to maybe take a look at the manipulation of data and be a little bit cautious about the way it's being done today and keep our eyes peeled for evidence of it. I mean, for example, asthma, going back to the great mayor of London and his asthma problem. Asthma, the highest occurrence of asthma of any people in the world is amongst skiers, cross-country skiers in Norway. Don't ask me why I know, I just do. 28% of cross-country skiers. These are the people who have the best quality, cleanest air in the world known to man, okay? But it's bloody cold, and cold air exacerbates constrictions of the airways. And if you look at the NHS website, they say the exact cause of asthma is unknown, full stop. Front page of the NHS. But it says it could be triggered by things like flu, cold air, or, wait for it, exercise. So if anybody tells you to get back on your bike and start walking again, tell them that you don't want to die of asthma and they can take a running jump. So that brings me to the 15-minute city, which practically every article, if you follow this story on the 15-minute city, pushes it as a good thing and describes the oppositions as either, conspiracists, very often far-right conspiracists. The Mayor Sadiq Khan, I hate to bring him up again, talked about anti-vaxxers and all the rest of it. So we're all kind of conspiracists. Then again, the South Yorkshire MP, Nick Fletcher, just last week, I think, described 15-minute cities as an international socialist concept. So you have, this thing doesn't do us any favors, does it? When, on one hand, the left call them right-wing conspiracists and the right-wing call us left-wing conspiracists. The whole thing just loses touch with reality. Meanwhile, people in councils keep on ploughing ahead with reducing road space in most urban areas. And we have to remember that for the uninitiated, or generally the ordinary member of society, 15-minute cities sound futuristic, sound progressive, sound positive. I mean, I was a big fan 40 years ago. But I think, like many things today, the word progressive hides an underlying restraint. The word progressive is being kind of adopted by people who are actually very often reactionary and regressive, I would argue. You can disagree if you wish. But 15-minute cities are not, in the current context and in the conversation, not about improving mobility, but about restraining mobility and stopping driving. And not enough people recognize that because it sounds such a positive model. It's not about building new cities. I'd be all in favor of it. I'm an architect. I'd be all in favor of building new cities. Those cities with fantastic accessibility to shops, to services, and all the rest of it. That's not what it's about. It's simply about removing cars from the existing streets, and it's a cheap way of doing urban design. It's all about restraint. Carolyn Lucas from the Green Party 10 years ago was writing about why we needed wartime rationing in all consumer goods as well as the way that we live. And this is what we're offering now in terms of dealing with the 15-minute city. Instead of more, instead of better, we're offered less. Instead of better infrastructure, we're told to use the existing infrastructure less. And under the last Labour government, again, if you remember them, John Prescott was encouraging transport planners only to invest in public transport if it would stop people driving. That was part of the Labour Party manifesto back in 1998, their transport manifesto. So suddenly, well not suddenly, but maybe gradually over 20 years, transport policy has become about inconvenience. How can we inconvenience drivers more so they make a modal shift? So it's become an anti-transport policy, in my views. Didn't really succeed back in the 1990s until lockdown, when the government and local authorities discovered they could do what they damn well pleased. Without asking anyone. Or if they did ask you, it didn't matter what you said, because they'd do it anyway, and you would be giving them the wrong answer. So I think they've always had, you can look at a sneaky regard for this conversation post-Brexit, when there's been a suspicion that people gave the wrong answer because of Brexit, and they've always wanted to ignore that. LTNs is one way of teaching people a lesson to know their place. We're consulted, but nobody really cares what you think. So I think that that's why these LTN protests, these ULEZ protests, these ZEZ protests are absolutely essential for democracy, taking back democracy. Better cities are something that we should all be interested in. That's fair enough, but that takes infrastructure, energy, creativity. It needs it needs a creative thinking which doesn't exist in the current climate. In fact, it's talking about restricted freedoms. It's about constraints on choices. It's about transport austerity. It's about inconvenience masquerading as convenience, and it's something that we should all fight back against. So to show that we're still here and they can't ignore us, more power to those people who are involved in the protests. And I hope we continue from strength to strength and show them who's real boss. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Justin.
Well, just two things. One is that this fake democracy, you gave the example of a small percentage being used as 60% in favour. Just as an aside, it happens everywhere, okay? So I'm an architect. No, apologies. And the architects' professional body have just done a consultation. There are 42,000 architects in Britain. They had 36 responses. And then they said 85% were in favour of changing the curriculum, so we're going to do it. You know what I mean? You think this is, and actually one of those respondents was me. So, so these things are, we're now manipulating democracy for our own effects. I think the only thing I wanted to say with the first guy was that technology isn't necessarily bad, it's how it's being used. Yeah, so well, there's two things. One is, I think things are bad enough as it is. We haven't got to invent the future of how terrible it's going to become. It's pretty bad now, and we need to start fighting against it. So, whether charging will be increasing or it'll become more insidious or more stealthy, I don't really care yet because it's bad enough as it is. I think the other thing to say is that, I always think that plant pots are very nice things in your house, but in the middle of the road, they become a problem. Do you know what I mean? So, it's not the thing itself, it's the way that it's being used, which actually is creating the problem. So, I'm a great tech fan. I just think we need to be a little bit cautious about how we become paranoid about everything that moves. I think the idea that travel broadens the mind is a useful thing to bear in mind, because what we're told these days is actually travel shrinks the mind, and we should know our place and stay where we are. So I think that, the idea about being able to move whether from place to place within a city or from city to city is something which fundamentally is affecting transportation modes across the board. So there are restrictions. We're talking about cars today, maybe. But obviously there's a conversation about flights, and maybe that we should fly less, partly because of this conversation about saving the planet or about reducing our consumption. But there's a general conversation which suggests that people are the problem, not people are the solution. It's an environmental conversation which says nature comes first, therefore humanity comes a very poor second. And I think we need to confront some of those broader conversations to put our needs and our desires front and center of this conversation rather than maybe some abstract discussion. So the second thing I want to say very quickly, I will be quick, is in terms of what is a city, which I think is the title of this conversation. And I've always thought, there's a difference between a city and a village. And the fundamental difference is that actually villages are quite non-congested. Cities, by their very nature, are congested spaces. And that's a good thing. More people crammed into a small space is really nice for socialization. It's about improving our capacities, our ability to think. Not many things in the last 150 years have been invented in tiny little villages. It's generally been the kind of concentrated effort of humanity being brought together in a city environment that has actually kind of concentrated the mind and taken education and science and development further forward. And I think the final thing to say is, since I drew on the conversation about pollution, and I know that a lot of people in the LTN conversation are flipping that and saying actually LTNs increase pollution in certain areas. So I stand by my stats in the very beginning, which is that pollution generally we have to recognize and we should celebrate is now nothing compared to what it was 50 years ago. As a matter of fact, actually, when you hear some of these stats as well, bear in mind that there was the British, UK national statistics on pollution. Then there was the European EU, remember them, imposition about statistics on the UK. And then the World Health Organization, the WHO statistics have just come down in 2021. So when you hear about, we don't meet our nitrous oxide standards, it's actually only been out 2 years. It's hardly surprising we don't meet it yet, right? But in many instances, we exceed anyway. Anyway, but I brought in this pollution conversation to say it's not necessarily a problem. I think if you use the argument that, LTNs put more traffic on this road and that increases pollution, you then find you're having the same argument as the people who want to ban cars in the bloody first place, right? So it's more the fact that I think we need to have a broader, wider conversation about the needs of mobility, rather than transport per se. Yes, that mobility is a good thing. Otherwise, we'll say there's more cars on this road. We need to stop them because it's causing pollution. That's exactly what Sadiq Khan is saying. That's what all the mayors are saying. And I think you'll find you're on a losing wicket. So let's just be a little bit more bold. Recognize that things are getting better. Don't necessarily get concerned about inventing how horrible things are going to be in the future, because I'm sure they will, but we can worry about that when we get there. Ultimately, let's have a much more positive idea about why mobility is a benefit, and it's nobody's business why we travel, just our own.